quiet park in a modern city, it's difficult to believe that there occurred here the largest single mutiny in the history of the British Armed Forces. This is Farrer Park in Singapore. In February 1942, up to 55,000 Indian troops gathered here. Many of them renounced their loyalty to the British and went over to the Indian National Army.
For much of history, India with China were the major superpowers of the world. From the 1500s to the 1700s, their riches attracted merchants and traders, including British, Portuguese, Dutch, French, even Danes. By the mid-1700s, the British had taken a dominant position among traders, with major centres on the east and west coasts of the Indian subcontinent. In 1757, the British, through the East India Company, took a major step. They sought to rule over one of the richest parts of India, the province of Bengal, then ruled by a Nawab. Robert Clive assumed the lead role, but he didn't rely on military power alone. He bought the loyalty of senior Bengali officials, including a general named Mir Jafar. The British advanced to confront the Nawab's army at a hunting lodge named Plassey, or Plassey. The clash that took place on 23 June 1757 is well presented in this diorama at the Dorset Military Museum. Here is the British Army, led by Robert Clive, around 3,000 strong. Here is the Nawab's army, including elephants and thousands of cavalry. Most of the British Army was made up of sepoys, Indian soldiers recruited to the British cause. Most of the Nawab's army was made up of horsemen, poorly armed and disciplined, although the Nawab did have a contingent of French artillery that, for a time, kept the British at bay. There was some brief skirmishing by the Bengali cavalry, and then a disaster for the Nawab's cause. His only loyal general, Mir Jafar, he is shown on the back of an elephant, was hit and killed. At this crucial moment, General Mir Jafar, who had been bought out by Clive, went over to the British, and the Nawab's army broke up following this mutiny. It was hardly a battle. Just 18 of the East India Company army had been killed, but it did turn the course of history. Robert Clive became a hero and immensely rich. The British established their rule, or Raj, and expanded it throughout India, with armies comprised mainly of loyal Indian sepoys. Over the next 100 years, British rule was consolidated, and regiments of men from Bombay, Madras, Bengal, and 1,000 other places fought and died for the British in the deserts and mountains of the region. There were some instances of unrest, namely mutinies at Vellore in 1806 and Barrackpore in 1824, but these were minor when compared to the military rebellion that erupted in 1857. The immediate cause of the rebellion was the use of new cartridges, said to be greased with a mixture of beef and pork fat, which made them unclean to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. Those units which refused to handle the cartridges were disarmed, but this was too late to stop an explosion of revolt. The first violence was at the large central military depot of the East India Company at Meerut. Sepoys rebelled, and in many cases killed their British officers. The Meerut mutineers then left for Delhi, leaving the British somewhat disorganised and unaccepting of what had happened. In Delhi, the sepoys called for the elderly Mughal emperor to lead their rebellion, and then they fortified the city. The British recovered relatively quickly, and with the aid of Sikh and Gurkha troops, retook the city after a bloody siege. The last Mughal emperor of India was taken away into captivity, and his sons were killed. The rebellion spread, however, throughout parts of northern India, to Lucknow, the capital of Oudh, and to other major cities. One notable figure was a woman ruler, the Rani of Jhansi, who personally led her troops against the British. There were atrocities committed by both sides. In Cawnpore, more than 500 British men, women and children were killed after they had surrendered their encampment. When a relieving army from Calcutta arrived in Cawnpore, they killed anyone suspected of being involved in the rebellion. The relief of Lucknow became an iconic event of the Victorian era, but behind the splendid images there had been much violence and destruction. In the streets and drawing rooms of Britain there came a cry for so-called justice. One method of punishment was being blown from the muzzles of cannon, an especially cruel punishment because Hindu belief held that those whose bodies were disintegrated could not enter the afterlife. There were other injustices as well. Here British soldiers are portrayed looting the dead. Some Indians, such as Tantia Tope, fought on, but theirs was a losing cause. By 1859 the rebellion was over. The British Raj had survived, and before too long, once again, the Indian sepoy became a respected and necessary figure in British India. Once again they fought in numerous campaigns and skirmishes. They were truly the backbone of British rule in India. So serve they did, Bengalis, Sikhs, Punjabis, and many others. Some representations of Britannia's military prowess provided little space for Indian soldiers. The next mutinies in the armed forces of British India took place in a distant land, in a centre of the empire known as the city of the Merlion, a mythical creature with the head of a lion and the body of a fish. That city is Singapore, for 100 years a bastion of British power in Asia. On 15 February 1915 there was a mutiny in the Punjabi unit, the 5th Light Infantry, whose men are pictured here. The mutiny was a bloody one. The men shot down their British officers, then rampaged through areas of northern Singapore. Today, these roads are occupied by busy traffic. In 1915, around 800 mutineers looted and smashed their way through these rural suburbs, killing men and women on a golf course and a park. Eventually, they were overwhelmed. Many were shot by firing squad, and the others imprisoned or exiled. Elsewhere in World War I, Indian troops fought bravely in battles such as at Tanga in East Africa, at Gallipoli, and in the costly campaign in Iraq. More than 1 million Indian soldiers served in the war, and 100,000 became casualties. An event soon after war's end shook Indian public opinion. In Amritsar, the Sikh holy city, on 13 April 1919, there was a peaceful anti-British demonstration in a garden called the Jallianwala Bagh. A small force of soldiers under the command of Brigadier General Reginald Dyer opened fire on the demonstrators. The official death toll was 379. It was probably much higher. The event led to increased support for independence advocates such as Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. In 1939, as in 1914, hundreds of thousands of Indians volunteered to serve in the British Armed Forces. However, there was a setback in North Africa when an Indian brigade was forced to surrender to the Germans in April 1941, and a number of those men joined the Germans as the first unit of the Indian National Army. Later in 1941, our focus has to swing back to Malaya and Singapore, the impregnable fortress of British rule. The city was fortified and well defended, but it had an Achilles heel to the north, the Malayan Peninsula, with its bays and cities and jungle, was not as well guarded. Throughout 1941, reinforcements had arrived. Here, an Indian regiment. Here are pictured Australians arriving in Singapore. Overall, there were 130,000 British troops under the command of General Arthur Percival. They would be opposed by General Yamashita. He had just 55,000 troops, but they were well trained in jungle warfare. The Japanese landed in Thailand in December 1941 and swept down into Malaya. The north was defended by the 11th Indian Division, made up of 2 English and 4 Indian regiments and some Gurkhas. The soldiers soon had to fight with limited cover from sea and air.